My whole legal name is JerryHill1. My Indian name is Haddadi. I'm a Bear Clan. I graduated from law school in 1976, University of California, Davis. And I pretty much worked for the tribe one way or the other since then. I retired in 2000, and after that I was the attorney for the Personnel Commission. So I was still working, indirectly for the tribe, but not the tribal government. When the court was established, I was nominated as a chief judge of the appellate court, and I accepted, and I was elected, and I've been here ever since. So we're going on 3 years with that now. So, like on and off, I worked for the tribe for about 40 years. When I was in school, law school, the land claims had been going on, or they had been renewed from 73 and even before that. And they had been in the Court of Claims. So I knew it from an academic point of view, but when I came home, I thought I would be working on them, and I really wasn't, because I was local counsel, and I was not involved directly in land claims at that time. The land claims were being directed by the Native American Rights Fund, and they were our attorneys. So, we had gone through that period of cases in the Court of Claims that were represented by other claims attorneys from 1950, and it's really kind of impossible to talk about these claims that started like in the 1800s and even in the 1700s. Like they're all full of history all the way along, and even now, I'm talking about 76, which was a long time ago. They were old then. So, it was like already it's a couple hundred years, and then the cases that had gone on, the representation that we had gone on, and it was pretty exotic stuff. And the attorneys from the Native American Rights Fund had been experienced in land claims. So, like I'm fresh out of law school, I read the cases, but reading cases and discussing cases like that is different than preparing cases to go to court where you want some actual results. And so I didn't really get involved in it that directly until I had met our attorneys, and I was able to go to those meetings, and I was able to see the complications that go along with trying a lawsuit, especially about land claims, especially about things that had happened for the last couple hundred years. And, it was really overwhelming. But I was glad I was there, and I learned a lot, from them attorneys. And even, I had my name on some of the cases. And I was like any other, the senior attorneys were representing the case, but, I was like one of the younger attorneys that was helping them out, and I get to sit at the table, and, it was very educational for me. And I thought it was good that I got to do that so I could, represent it to people that knew me in the tribe, tell them that, yeah, I was involved in land claims. But the basic part of my job was not land claims. It was more of mundane things that go on inside the tribe. And it was also the representation of, the business committee and the general counsel with regard to proposed legislation, with regard to more advisory types of things that go on in a government. So, like I was an advising attorney without necessarily being the primary representative for the tribe. One of the things we had talked about was whether or not there was any basis for land claims for the land in Wisconsin. The land claims that we were talking about in terms of the nation were older land claims for land located in New York. And, you know, the land claims potential for this reservation were based on lands that had been lost after the allotment, and there was, you know, like a lot of land lost at that time, and there was a lot of connivance going on between developers and the superintendent of the reservation at the time. And what we had determined was that there was a need to know of all the parcels, and there was hundreds of them. If you've ever seen that map, you know, that's got all the allotments, hundreds, you know, like it was to be that, you know, heads of family got 90 acres and then other people got 45, and it was kind of broke down as to, you know, the family, you know, depending on the size of the family. And the other thing was that the reservation at that time was still 65,000 acres, but the land wasn't all the same. I mean, some of it was, you know, good for farming, and some of it was, you know, good for other things, and some of it wasn't good for anything. You know, I mean, there's swamps and quarries and, you know, things like that. And what had been proposed, which I learned later from my own research and reading, was that after the Civil War, the United States was in deep financial debt. And one of the ways that they were looking at getting out of that debt was opening up the land so that they could become productive. But they were bringing in, you know, like lots of immigrants to do that. And one of the things they needed was to modernize the transportation system, which meant railroads, you know, and railroads had to run across land, and, you know, that meant that Indians were in the way or their lands were in the way, and so that became something. And then there was the various gold rushes that came on, in which immigrants just poured in, you know, and the government was not protecting the Indian land as they had said they would. And so there was a result, you know, the wars that came on against the Plains Indians and the Western Indians, mainly in the name of development. That was like in the 1800s. I mean, in the 17 to 1800s, after the Civil War. And when you look at it, it was like the same time that the Allotment Acts were passed, and that we weren't fighting the cavalry, but those other Indians were. And that was kind of held out to us because, you know, our leaders knew what was going on over there. And so, you know, it's like it is now. When things go on in Indian country, you hear about them all over the place, and you hear about them just like that. And I think that our ancestors heard about them the same way. So there was a kind of an intimidation factor that if you don't do what the government wants, that, you know, the cavalry will be there and the soldiers will be there, and they're going to, you know, not protect you the way they should, and they would promise food and medical care and things like that that were really not delivered, or they were delivered under threat, or they were delivered, you know, kind of with, if you don't go back to the reservation, you're not going to get the food. And so it was held up really against the tribes, and really the whole tribe, not just the soldiers or the warriors. It was like women and children and old people, and, you know, so that's what the Indians were always fighting about. And I think that over here, it was relatively peaceful, but they were still subject to the same kind of double standards, you know, on threatening behavior, and that's how the major part of the land was lost. There was supposed to be a 25-year period of protection, but they figured out a way of compromising the 25-year period. So that was the basis of, if we can prove that there was fraud in the transfers, that we could, you know, potentially have a land claims case. That was the theory of it. The problem with it was that the people that were in the government didn't exactly want to start a land claims with people that we lived with. I mean, you know, like, this is pretty much over 50% non-Indian living on the reservation. And, you know, there was just not a lot of interest. So what we did instead was we established a title search program. And the title search program was really like 3 or 4 old ladies that would go down to the various courthouses, and what we would do is start with the present ownership and work back all the conveyances until they got to the time from the Indian claims land identification, and, you know, up to the present, so that we could see, like, who held it. Well, there was a lot of innocent people that held it, but there was a lot of developers who had put people up to come out and, you know, develop it. And they were the ones that also dealt with the Indians to, once the allotment was made, that they would provide loans and whatnot for Indians to buy equipment and seed and stuff to be farmers. And, you know, with the understanding, like, this was the security for the loan that they were given. When the crops come in and they sell them, then they could pay off their debt for the, you know, for the equipment and seed and animals and things of that nature. And that was how most of the land got stolen, and that was the basis of establishing that, you know, people had gotten screwed out of their land, and there was banks and other developers that were named in those transfer documents that, you know, made us believe that there was a claim if the government would bring it, because the government was really the one that had to bring it and not the individuals who lost out. It might be gone, like, that was in the 70s, and the land would have been stolen like 50 years before that. And there could have been, you know, numerous, you know, transfers in between. So that was the basis of that. But we, you know, we used that, and it was developed to the point of the tribe having an tract index on all the land on the reservation, you know, and even now you could see, like, what we had in the 70s. And, you know, the tribe started a buyback policy. That was the long-range policy, is as it becomes available, we'll buy it back at whatever the prevailing rates were, rather than start a land claims that was going to probably generate a lot of resistance, not just from the individuals, but from their governments as well. And, you know, I think that even the relations we have now with, like, Hobart are kind of like based on the fact that they use the scare tactics that the tribe is going to do this or the tribe's going to do that. And, you know, they've actually opposed the land that we've bought, you know, from putting into trust. And, you know, recently they lost a 500, you know, acres. It wasn't a solid acres, but the total of all the land was about 500 acres. They opposed that for a long time, and it finally went into trust. And, you know, so that was kind of a successful part of that, but it's not very dramatic, you know, because it's all kind of in the paper and it's gone over a period of time. But you could see, you know, from looking at the map, if you look at a modern map of the tribe, you know, the tribe's land holdings, what we had in 76 and, how many more thousands that we have of it now. And ultimately we'd say like, well, we want to buy it all back, whether that's possible or whether or not there would be intervening circumstances, we don't know. But I think that that's a good ambition, and I think that the tribe's been very successful, in taking advantage that way. So it's based on what we knew, what we could find out, and what the law said are recognized as our authority to do, like purchase the land and then under the law put it back in trust status. And then we regulate it. So there's been quite a few thousand acres that we've come back, and they set policy goals of 50% by so and so, like that. And I think that that's a good systematic way to proceed. Whether or not we would succeed on the land claims, especially like in the atmosphere we're in now, is very hostile, in the law. And, the likelihood of, you couldn't guarantee that you win if they contest it, but, you could say, well, we had a good, strong case. Well, good, strong cases get lost and get dismissed too. So, that's the risk of it can get worse, it might get better, and maybe there's another way to do it. So I think we took that approach of systematic, legally forcing it without necessarily ruffling everybody's feathers that, was against the tribe. I don't think there really was. There may have been some kind of an emotional connection to that, but, you got to remember that most of that stuff went on around 1900 to 1910. And by the time we're talking about it like almost 3 generations later. So, the effect of knowing that, some of your family may have become refugees on the reservation and, like that, it doesn't impact you as strongly as, if it happened to your grandma, and she was telling you what it was like. And, when you talk about it like that, they can tell you about the kind of a feeling, but the impact was muted, I think, by time, and I think that the reaction was more of a acceptance of the fact that we were outnumbered and outpowered governmentally, and that we couldn't expect the government to stand in and honor its obligation to us. In fact, that was barely known. What happened at the time when the governments were formed, they were formed for the purpose of meeting the administrative obligations of the federal government to the tribe. They weren't meant that we were to be like white people and elect our leaders and that we would be directed, that kind of thing. I think that was mainly a difference in outlook, and it was kind of reduced to more simplistic, emotional, issues rather than, people feeling like our family got screwed and we needed revenge. It was more like the community got screwed, like all other Indians were getting screwed, and there wasn't much you could do about it. I mean, that was like a real helpless situation, and it wasn't that people were cowardly or passive. It was that they were really under the gun in a way that it's even hard to imagine right now. It's like, well, we got kids. Would you let your kids be taken away and sent to school for 4 or 5 years? I mean, like no way that's happening now, but, at the time they did that, and you have to wonder, like, why did they do that, And a lot of it has to do with, the destitution that was here. There was no jobs here. The government wasn't coming through with the food or money that they had promised. There was no follow through on taking care of. You really had to take care of yourself, and it was rough. So I think that there wasn't a strong feeling of revenge in the sense of let's go after them on the land claims. There were some people that felt like that, but in general, I didn't see it. I didn't feel like there's a strong feeling that we got screwed, but there was not a strong feeling of what we should do about it. And at that time also, we began to have more economic progress through federal programs that allowed us to take on and do things. So there's a lot of different energy going out in different places, like when they did the housing authority, that was, they could build houses, and, like they started up that Indian Action Team. Even your grandpa was part of that. And it was taking, guys way younger than yourself, like in their 20s, and, teaching them trades, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, things like that. And that was the team. And, like a lot of Indians, our Oneida Indians, had become journeymen in the crafts, and they were with the labor union, the carpenters union, the electricians, and all that. So they were recognized and certified people in those fields. But there was, there's always a lot of controversy about that. Who was getting it, who was getting the jobs, whether those guys even knew what they were doing, whether they were being properly supervised. It's like almost everything we do gets criticized, and it gets criticized heaviest from within. And that was happening too. But the overall success to the tribe was being able to bring in those resources and then provide jobs that would usually go out to white people before. So you got a bunch of white people doing your stuff, and you say, well, why can't we do it? Well, you don't have any qualified people. Now we had qualified people, and that kind of worked right along as we've gone on over the years. We had better education, and in the past, when people got educated, there's no jobs. Now we were beginning to have jobs. We were beginning to develop middle managers. We were beginning to, you don't necessarily start off in an entry-level job and stay there forever. There are jobs like that, but basically managers and educated administrators and things of that nature. Things were changing and things were growing, and like at that time, we were also looking into cigarettes and things like that, and all those economic developments kind of followed one on the other, and that was part of our job, writing ordinances to control that stuff, and being able to provide jobs, and I think that the membership in general was appreciative of the fact that we were now able to do those kinds of things, and it actually gave the tribe a presence as a employer that they hadn't had before. It's like even one of your aunts, Anna John, she was very outspoken, and she was she was involved in the government because she wasn't afraid to talk. But when they had no money, they were always going down to the banks and waiting. And in one of those times that she had gone down there, waiting to see if they'd give us a loan to make a building or something, and she sat and waited. And finally she just snapped and started raising hell about if I was a Green Bay Packer, you wouldn't have me sitting out there. She was a pretty amazing person, but it was like that. It's like now people are lined up to have business with us, and they go meet the committee, and everybody's very respectful about the business opportunities that they would like the tribe to invest in, and even our own people, you know, coming up with things they're proposing, you know, like how we can continue our growth. But in the beginning, it was, you know, like trying to do the best you could with whatever opportunities happened to be there, and one of them happened to be cigarettes. And, you know, that started off no control, no regulation, nothing. It was like, you know, some Indians up in Michigan and out west had discovered, you know, you could get consignments of cigarettes from manufacturers. And if you were on a main road, just set yourself up a shack and, you know, sell cigarettes. And trucks would go by there, and, you know, they'd stop and they'd buy cases and cases of, you know, cigarettes that they could throw in their trucks, and wherever they were going, then they could sell them, you know, cheaper. So that became, you know, one of those bases of who gets to regulate the sale of tobacco. And of course the feds do, but so do the states. And that became an issue that, you know, went to the courts, and finally it was determined that the sale of cigarettes was subject to both tribal regulation and state regulation in terms of tax, because, you know, the cigarettes were not going to be used on the reservation, and they were not going to be used personally. They were going to be used commercially. I mean, like, you don't buy a box of cigarettes or cartons of, crates of cigarettes, you know, for personal use. You know, like, you're going to sell them someplace, and there's always going to be somebody to buy them. So that became a legal issue, and we went to court, and ultimately it was lost by the tribes. We didn't go to court on it, but, you know, when we started selling cigarettes here, then there was an issue internally of who gets to do it. Does a tribal member get to do it, or does the tribe do it? We wrote the ordinance so that it was a tribal monopoly, that the tribe would grant licenses to whoever could do it, but they granted no licenses to individuals. So it was a tribal monopoly. And at the time, that was just another way of you know, making some money. I mean, generating money. And it was never, I mean, it was a lot more than was there before, but it was, like, compared to now, it was chump change, you know. So as we're growing, you know, like, we're doing those kinds of things, and then, you know, then it was bingo, and then it was, you know, casino, and we, you know, we kept on the diversification of different things, and, you know, growing into what we, you know, now have today. And it's still, you know, subject to internal criticism and external criticism, and, you know, the forces of the government, both the state, the local, and the federal, that our people are, you know, our government representatives are, you know, fighting, and our lawyers are fighting. So it kind of like never ends. In the past, and I'm saying in the past, there was, you know, probably in the 20s and 30s, when there was a lot of unregulated activities, there was attempts to put casinos on reservations, and that was resisted by the federal government, and they passed laws that no mechanical machines. They were talking about slot machines at the time, old-time machines where, you know, it was all mechanical. You stick in the money and you pull the lever, and you could even, you know, watch the thing go around. Now it's all electronic, but at that time, the resistance was from the federal government, and they passed, you know, congressional legislation. And so that was enough, you know, and sometimes it would go on. They even had it here. I remember when I was a little kid, you know, they'd have slot machines like down by, you remember that old bar across from White Eagles? It used to be Skylar's, and then it was Four of a Kind. It had been owned by lots of different people.
It was big when I was there buying some chips.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, that's the way it would be, you know, like our parents would be in the bar drinking, and we'd go in and, you know, like, we're sitting in the car, And so we go in and hassle them, and you think, get us some pop and get us some chips or whatever, you know. And I remember that there were slot machines, and I also remember that they didn't last long. I mean, you know, like you're a kid, what do you know? You know, that's just part of the, you know, atmosphere. And, you know, but the federal government would come in and take them out. So when the casinos first started, those laws had to be overcome. But they didn't start with casinos, they started with bingo. And bingo started in Florida, and what we call bingo in terms of, you know, tribal bingo is regulated by the tribe. And the tribe had, the Seminole tribe on one of their, some of their land down there, had a piece of land that they were making into a museum. And, you know, they had their plans and everything was approved. It was an economic development that was approved by the federal government. But then the tribe used the ground floor for a casino, you know, I mean, not casino, but a bingo, you know. And then the bingo was not just bingo, it was like high stakes bingo. I mean, bingo that had gone on like around here was regulated by the State Bingo Control Board, and they would say who could do it. And you had to apply for a license, and it would be like churches and other non-commercial, you know, outlets. It would be like not-for-profits and those kinds of businesses. And, you know, at the time, we were talking about having bingo, and they said, well, we're going to have to apply to the state for a license. And that's when we were saying, like, no, we don't. And it said we're not private enterprise, and we don't want to say we're a nonprofit, you know, organization, because that's in a different kind of a category. We're a government, and the government, as a government, we're exempt from being regulated by the state. And so what had gone on in Florida had kind of blown up there, and they were saying, like, the tribe fraudulently attempted to indicate that they were creating this cultural building, and then, you know, they were using it as a subterfuge to put in high stakes bingo. And so high stakes bingo was like, they're talking about, you know, like hundreds of dollars of, you know, prizes, you know, for the games. And before, they'd been like very small games. And the state here, for example, allowed them to have however many games, you know, and they were regulated as to how much they could give and how much they could charge. And they had these bingo agents that would come in. They're like police, you know, they could issue citations and stuff like that. And then there was a lot of resistance from the churches who said it really wasn't fair that the tribe should do this. And so we had it set up for us that this would ultimately come down to a confrontation, a legal confrontation. And in the meantime, the state of Florida was going after the Seminoles, and that became the cause. You know, it was like, well, is it bingo, or is high stakes bingo a different kind of gambling that they had in mind, blah, blah, blah. And they first put out the legal test of whether or not the activity was a crime, you know, that would be punishable by jail, or whether or not it was a civilly regulated activity. I mean, you know, like, if it's a crime, the state has jurisdiction. If it's a civilly regulated activity, then the tribal government has authority to regulate a civil activity on the reservation, just like a tribe. And that went on kind of like throughout the states, and it also happened here when we're doing it. And in the meantime, there was so many inventive people that came up with games that were based on bingo that were just, I mean, yeah, they were bingo, but and they weren't the kind of bingo that you're used to. They were, you know, like they had a game over here. They used to call it speed bingo, and you know, I don't even remember how it worked, but I remember it was fast. You know, it was like whip out the cards, and you know, all of a sudden it was done. You know, and they said, well, that ain't bingo. And I said, well, yes, it is. It has the same, you know, letters, and it has the same 75 numbers, and you know, like it's, you know, so you get in an argument as to what's bingo, and that evolved to bingo being a certain kind of a game, and then other games which were considered casino games. And that's when, you know, the federal government got involved, and these cases kind of converged. We had a case here that we went to the district court in Milwaukee, and we alleged that the State Bingo Control Board had no authority to do anything about the games that we were having, and that they were regulated by a tribal ordinance that said how many games we could have. And actually we were talking about in a really kind of a limited way, you know, to say like, well, we wanted them on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday because those were busy days for people. And of course they had them down at the Civic Center, which meant that the kids couldn't use, you know, the gym when it was being used for bingo, and the bingo kept it kind of expanding until, you know, like that's an internal thing, you know, where people were saying like, that place was made for, you know, the kids to, you know, have a place to recreate and that. And then we had an issue over who could work there, because the first bingo people that could work there were really a couple Indian girls from West De Pere who brought in their friends, their white friends, you know, and they were like the initial bingo workers, you know, and we said, you can't do that, you know. Part of our setup was that this was an economic development enterprise that provided jobs and income that we didn't get any other way. We had no basis to tax, and so, you know, we used this as a means of fundraising. And anyhow, we got a lot of flack internally that, you know, we were discriminating, you know, against white people. And we said, we're not discriminating against white people. We're being consistent in our claim that this is for the benefit of Indians. And so we had to confine all of our employment to tribal members. And that was really, I mean, it was really pretty nasty internally. But, you know, like we went through and stuck with it, and, you know, it kind of led to a couple nights a week, and then, you know, a couple hours a night, and then it expanded until it got like, well, it was making so much money they could, you know, do it one more day, and they could do it longer, and they could have bigger payouts. And it was a real, actually, it's kind of an exciting time, you know, because it just kept, it's like it kept on expanding, you know, it kept getting bigger and bigger, and they built the Irene Moore, you know, activity center. So they said, well, we can have community meetings there, and we'll also have bingo. Well, we didn't have very many community buildings there because, you know, like bingo just expanded until it was like, goddamn, 24 hours. I mean, then they had these inter-tribal games, you know, where they, you know, then the prizes went up, you know, like 25,000, 50,000. I mean, it was like really high stakes bingo. And, you know, it was amazing. And then the cases kept going up to the Supreme Court until they finally, you know, that Supreme Court got it, and they said that that's right, that anything that the state can do to regulate an activity, the tribes could do as governments. And so we could regulate that. And then, you know, then that kind of took off to Congress, and Congress said, that's messed up that tribes have that advantage, you know, and they should have to, you know, address what kind of games they have and whether those games were regulated or criminalized games, you know, where there was actually, you know, people could go to jail for doing it. You know, like bingo, they wouldn't put you to jail. What they do is just give you a citation, and then you have to pay the citation. So, you know, like when they got down to gambling and when they started having hearings on gambling, then that's when the classes of gaming were defined under federal law. They said class one is tribal gaming. That was traditional, the way different tribes, you know, gambled. And they did some heavy gambling, but it was always internal to the tribe and Indians. The second was bingo, class two gaming, and that, you know, then we had arguments over what's class two. We know bingo. Well, what about Keno? You know, and what about pull tabs? And, you know, like all this other bullshit went on. And then finally, class three was to be duly regulated by the state and tribe, and that's why we had to come up, you know, why compacts came into being, you know, with that, and we had to negotiate with the state on, you know, what was to be legal in the state, and that would include the kind of games, the number of games, how it would be regulated. And bingo by then was already a distant past. I mean, nobody cared about bingo anymore. It's like even in the big casinos, they'll have a bingo room. I mean, and it'll be pretty big. And a lot of people still love bingo, but you know, the money makers are the slot machines and the table games. And at the time, we had been meeting intertribally in Wisconsin saying when the Gaming Regulatory Act is passed, which it probably will be, then we will go together and negotiate together. Well, you know, intertribal promises of sticking together usually don't last. In fact, they never become reality because tribes, you know, they're double talking. You know, like as soon as that act was signed into law, the nominees were already down there, and the whole chunks were already ready to, you know, they already had a agreement that they wanted to sign, and nothing got done. But the Lakota tribe had this attorney, a really smart guy. He got him, you know, I says, I don't know what they're going to pass, but whatever that first compact is, I says, that's what everybody will get, because they ain't going to do different, you know, like games for different tribes. They had other ways of negotiating, but it wasn't that. So anyhow, that guy had got a compact to have poker and slot machines, and I would have bet $1 million they're never going to do that. You know, I didn't know what it was going to be, but I didn't think it would be that. And there it was. You know, I said, holy shit, I was wrong. You know, like then we're all negotiating for how many slot machines we would have and how many places would be allowed to gamble. It's kind of like the way it is now. And then I think the compact was for 5 years. And then it was renegotiated and ultimately became a permanent, you know, agreement. But, you know, who's to say nothing is actually permanent? I mean, if somebody can get us running, then it ain't going to happen. But I think that now it's become a fixture in the state's economy. You know, the state gets a lot of money from the tribes, and the surrounding areas get a lot of the local spin-off businesses, you know, from the casinos. And then, you know, we provide employment for lots and lots of people, and there's places where you don't even have enough Indians to run the whole thing, you know, so you hire outside people. So now it's an employment organization too, and that's the way, you know, that's the way it is now. Okay, I'll be right there. But, you know, like, so that was, you know, kind of like a quickie part of that history. But, man, we had so much there was so much stuff going on. Like we started a lottery, and Gordy had started that, and we bought all the lottery machines that Michigan had been using, and we bought them. And we're setting up this network, and people are going for it. And then all of a sudden, the agents swooped in, and they were going to confiscate all that. And then we're hiding, the here and there, and we're hiding our pull tabs because they're going to make a raid, and it's pretty exciting. But yeah, that was, that went on, and I think that was really the benefit of the fact that the tribes had become good managers of the programs that we did for the federal government when we did 638. So all the time we're developing, when we got into this business and we needed managers, we had trained managers. And a lot of tribes were looking to outside people to do that, and we were like one of the first tribes that said, we don't need them. We can do it all ourselves. And people were doubtful, but it turned out that we could do it ourselves, and we became kind of like leaders in the field for a while. And then after a while, it just got so goddamn big that I was telling Rick a few years ago, I says, we used to be the biggest, Indian gaming in the United States. I says, now we're just another face in the crowd, way back in the crowd. But it was a lot of growth and development, and I think there's still a dependency on it. And that led to a lot of diversification. It also led to the Indian gaming NIGA, the tribes getting together and becoming a lobbying force in Washington. And that was another tremendous growth, where now you get listened to because they need your money, they need your support, they know that the locals are dependent on us for jobs. There's lots of power and stability in the gaming, because of that. So, that's an ongoing story. And now they're into electronic, gaming, and who the hell knows where that is? That's another whole level of gaming where, you need different kind of experts. It's going to go on until it don't go on no more.